Sarah will be facilitating this event. And Sarah Leonard is the editor at Lux, a forthcoming Marxist women's magazine. She's the editor-at-large at Dissent and a contributing editor to The Nation and The Appeal. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Republic, and probably everywhere else. And she's also the co-editor of two collections, Occupy, Scenes from the Occupied America and Verso, and The Future We Want, Radical Ideas, and The New Century, Metropolitan. Take it away, Sarah.
Hi. It's wonderful to be here and with you all, if not seeing you all. Should I do your introduction? Is that okay? So I'm going to do a quick introduction for Breanne, whose book is launching today, and you can all buy it. But here it is. It looks gorgeous. It looks very manifesto-y. It looks like you could wrap a manifesto around it and throw it through a window. It's nice and substantial. Breanne Fahs is professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University, and she has published widely in feminist, social science, and humanities journals and has authored 5 books. Performing Sex, Valerie Solanas, Out for Blood, Firebrand Feminism, and Women, Sex, and Madness. This is an extremely exciting sounding collection of titles also. And she has co-edited 2 volumes, The Moral Panics of Sexuality and Transforming Contagion. She's the founder and director of the Feminist Research on Gender and Sexuality Group at Arizona State University, and she also works as a clinical psychologist in private practice. So I'm very excited to be participating in launching this book. I had a really fantastic time going through it. It's an incredible collection of manifestos. And in dark times, it can make you feel actually quite good that you have not only a legacy to draw on, but quite a vibrant and dramatic one. It really brought me a lot of pleasure. So I wanted to start by turning it over to Breanne to read a bit of the intro of the book and also a manifesto of choice.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and doing this, even though it's weird because this event was supposed to be in person, so we're all adapting to this new world order. And Sarah, thank you so much because you're amazing in your own right, and it's just such an honor. So I think I'm going to read just a tiny snippet of the introduction so that you all can get a feel for this book, and then I want to read a single page, the very first manifesto in the collection, which is one of my favorites. And I think it sets a good tone for understanding for people who have no exposure or not much exposure previously to manifestos, what they feel like and sound like, and kind of the way that they hit you on both an emotional level and a literary level and artistic level and, in every other way. So I want to do a little bit of both. So I'm going to start with just reading a tiny snippet of the introduction, which I've called The Bleeding Edge on the Necessity of Feminist Manifestos. Life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex. So begins Valerie Solanas' 1967 Scum Manifesto, with one of the great, all-time great declarations of war against the patriarchal status quo. Solanas imagined not only an entirely new world, where men no longer defined great art, money, government, and culture, but also one populated by thrill-seeking females, dominant, secure, self-confident, nasty, violent, selfish, independent, proud, thrill-seeking, freewheeling, arrogant females who consider themselves fit to rule the universe, who have freewheeled to the limits of this society and are ready to wheel on to something far beyond what it has to offer. She wrote the manifesto for those in the gutter, which she called whores, dykes, criminals, and homicidal maniacs, wholly refusing to pander to nice, passive, accepting, cultivated, polite, dignified, subdued, dependent, scared, mindless, insecure, approval-seeking daddy's girls. Feminist manifestos exploded onto the scene from 1967 to 1971, a period marked by rampant sexism, emerging feminist resistance, consciousness raising, and collective organizing. Building on the momentum of the civil rights movement, the feminist revolts of the late 1960s paved way for decades of feminist activism that followed. The validation of women's anger in the late 1960s, a cultural zeitgeist moment that recognized women as finally fed up and truly enraged, made it possible for women to push back against cultural pressures for politeness and respectability. Instead, they fumed and ranted, scuffled and shouted, locked arms and marched. The sort of feminism found in early manifestos featured a starkly different brand of feminism from the more likable, friendly, and benign one we have come to know in today's institutions, like education, government, and corporate leadership. Second wave manifestos honored a sweaty, frothing, high-stakes feminist anger that swept through their writing. Their words burn and simmer even today, giving them an unexpected freshness. In many ways, I assembled this book not to entertain or amuse, but because we need this kind of work in our lives. Feminist manifestos are a necessity in times of great social stress. How else are we to make sense of our own anger, our sense of confusion and implosion, our imminent feelings of doom and stifled possibilities? The urgency of manifestos, that clear sense that they sit right on the cutting edge, leaves a palpable feeling that the ink has yet to dry, that we are, as Julian Hanna writes, on the bleeding edge of things. Regardless of when they were written, manifestos pulsate with newness and freshness. They pry open eyes we would rather shut, forcing us to reckon with the scummy, dirty, awful truths we would rather not face. And if ever there is a time for a collection of feminist manifestos, if ever it felt necessary to compile documents that celebrate women's rage, now is that time. I think I'll stop there for the introduction. But I want to read you now a manifesto. So this one is called I Want a President. It was written in 1992 by Zoe Leonard. It feels a bit relevant to today's moment too. Okay, so it goes like this. I want a dyke for president. I want a person with AIDS for president, and I want a fag for vice president, and I want someone with no health insurance, and I want someone who grew up in a place where the earth is so saturated with toxic waste that they didn't have a choice about getting leukemia. I want a president that had an abortion at 16, and I want a candidate who isn't the lesser of two evils, and I want a president who lost their last lover to AIDS, who still sees that in their eyes every time they lay down to rest, who held their lover in their arms and knew they were dying. I want a president with no air conditioning, a president who has stood on the line at the clinic, at the DMV, at the welfare office, and has been unemployed and laid off and sexually harassed and gay bashed and deported. I want someone who has spent the night in tombs and had a cross burned on their lawn and survived rape. I want someone who has been in love and been hurt, who respects sex, who has made mistakes and learned from them. I want a Black woman for president. I want someone with bad teeth, someone who has eaten that nasty hospital food, someone who cross-dresses and who has done drugs and been in therapy. I want someone who has committed civil disobedience. And I want to know why this isn't possible. I want to know why we started learning somewhere down the line that a president is always a clown, always a John and never a hooker, always a boss and never a worker, always a liar, always a thief and never caught. We'll stop there for that first introductory manifesto.
It's such a good one to start on. It's very satisfying.
It is, isn't it? It is a little bit like medicine, these manifestos, I think, especially right now.
Yeah, it cuts right through the sort of quarantine, seasonal affective disorder.
Right, yeah.
And I wanted to start by asking you, clearly we are in a moment of ferment. On the one hand, there's increasing radicalization in the United States. People are talking about socialism in a way they never were before. The sort of range of political possibilities seems much wider. There's also been a distinct and really powerful shift in feminism where we're seeing, women's strikes from Argentina to Poland to New York. And in the States specifically, the outpouring of feminist anger after Trump's election, some of it really radical, some of it not particularly, some of it sort of finding its feet. And I was curious, when you went to put this together, you say in your introduction how ephemeral the manifesto is as a form. And you quote someone saying, you know, you may have encountered a manifesto whizzing past your head while wrapped around a brick. And so I was curious, in taking these sort of ephemeral documents and putting them in a book, what are you hoping to give people right now?
Yeah, I mean, it is a weird thing, right? We're taking this whole body of work that really isn't meant to be recorded into history in that sort of traditional sense. And it's not supposed to be speaking beyond its particular moment that it's written. These aren't documents for all time in some ways. So the ephemeral quality of it is a really strange thing to try to both collect and contain and somehow make sense of. But I think the thing about this book that really matters to me, and there's lots of things about it that matter to me, but this one in particular, is that the Feminist Manifesto does have a sort of history that has been largely neglected. And so thinking about the manifesto form only in relation to things like the Communist Manifesto, which is usually the only manifesto that people can immediately bring to mind, feels like it trims out all of this amazing work that's happened kind of on the margins within feminist traditions of anger, of fighting back against patriarchy, of thinking about, you know, what does it mean, for example, to have, there's entire bodies of work within this book, for example, on things just about anger and violence, or trash and class-based rage, thinking about queer and trans bodies of work together, that really feels like when you look through this book, you realize this rich history has been there sort of right underneath our nose. And it's been, you know, replaced in large part by a lot more sanitized versions of feminism that are much more palatable and less angry and more sort of, you know, at least on the surface level, sort of inclusive, whatever that means. I think inclusive becomes this sort of code word for like not angry and not confrontational and, you know, not radical in some ways. But yeah, I think, you know, it's difficult to imagine what is the manifesto form? How does the manifesto form fit into a collection? And then how do we make sense of it if those documents were never really meant to be historicized exactly in this way? So when you're moving through it, you're not supposed to sort of react to it like only in relation to this particular historical moment, although of course we do that, but also thinking about, you know, what these documents might have meant at the time as well. So that's funny when it hits you emotionally, because when it hits you emotionally, it's hard to do that as well. So I don't think there's any one way to sort of approach this text, right? You can sort of look at it as a scholar, or you can just read it for like its sort of emotional tenor. You can feel the sort of emotional impact of different manifestos. And I mean, one thing I love too is that they shift between feeling super relevant and then sort of, you know, going dormant, and then another cultural moment will come along where these feel relevant again. Like, you know, I Want a President by Zoe Leonard is completely relevant to this moment again. The next manifesto in the collection is, you know, a manifesto written by ACT UP in the early days of AIDS activism. That one feels like it's written for us right now again, whereas maybe 6 months ago I wouldn't have said that. It felt more historical to me 6 months ago. So you can see that they also play with time and relevance, and the way that they speak to us is different and it moves.
Absolutely. And maybe following on that point, are there particular manifestos that you found yourself turning to in this book right now, either having to do with the way that people feel trapped and isolated, or the ways that, you know, you mentioned was, you know, also fighting against a disease, but specifically fighting with the government to deal correctly with a disease, engaged in some of, you know, the most radical activism and organizing this country's seen. And, you know, there are so many different aspects of the current crisis that might be reflected in different manifestos, or through which different manifestos might actually bring you comfort or inspiration. And I guess I'm asking you, like, for the COVID manifestos.
Well, I think all the ones about housework feel particularly relevant again. You know, like this, like the wages for housework, the labor ones just are everywhere to me in there. There's a whole section on trash, and I love that section in particular. And I think in part because I really feel like we're on the brink of seeing this massive kind of new wave of thinking about feminism and labor politics like colliding. And it's going to be really, really interesting and exciting. I was asked by a reporter from Chile last week about what the next 10 years of feminism is going to look like, which is kind of an intense question. But one of the things that I do think we're going to see is a lot more interest in, like, you know, class-based rage as it collides with feminist rage. And those things are very real and palpable. And when, you know, they're fused together, it's really exciting. And I think it's maybe the best medicine we have right now. So yeah, that whole section on trash, I'm really enjoying again. And then all of the, like, again, all the wages for housework, all the domestic labor, like the complainers, you know, like I feel like everyone I know is in that mode of just like sort of being overwhelmed by domesticity, isolation. Like that stuff feels, it has these nice long roots into feminist struggles of thinking about the mundane and how like actually depressing the mundane can be sometimes, and battles for power and labor and stuff just coming to life. So for me, that's what speaks to me right now, but there's so many others too that I feel like are, you know, good antidotes about the importance of anger.
There is, I think we were talking a little before the panel about how sometimes people will read a book like this as a way of representing the fights within feminism, but actually, you said, and I actually don't read it this way, it seems to me like closer to a genealogy where you have these things sort of haphazardly piling up over time, and they do bear some relation to each other. Even when they're in conflict, they sort of need each other to move forward and develop these ideas. And I was kind of curious whether you saw any sort of evolution of the Feminist Manifesto or some change over time in what they look like or how they express themselves. You know, you have like very traditional looking ones, both in the past and the present, that sort of lay out a program almost. And you have ones like Zoe Leonard's, which are much more polemical. And so I was kind of curious if you see some sort of like overarching story about the Feminist Manifesto here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's my own strange lens that I bring to this, but it also sometimes feels like you take the Scum Manifesto as this nucleus somehow, and it like radiates outward. So somehow in this book, it feels a little bit like that. Like there's like the Valerie Solanas, like atomic impact right in the middle, and it kind of like moves outward. But yeah, you see, I mean, I think what's fun about the manifestos is they can range from this very like clear appropriation of like, you know, like serious, scholarly, like in-depth, very brainy, very cerebral kind of manifestos that are like hitting on emotion, but they're also really trying to do this kind of like unraveling of very particular, I don't know, like kind of a scholarly, more of a scholarly text. And then you have these wild ones that are kind of just like a splash of an idea, or just kind of like it feels like they were like written sort of in a manic episode on a typewriter or something. So those, and there's lots of those I think in here that in various sections. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's not a genre that's staying the same over time for sure. And different moments, we need different things. You know, some of them feel a lot more clearly artsy or of like these sort of art traditions, which also has a very rich legacy in the history of manifestos. And some of them, you know, are going more for like, kind of like an affect sort of standpoint, right? So raging out against religion, or, you know, being a cleaner at a hospital and people like overlooking you. And, you know, and some of them also speak from, I think, more intensely personal experiences, and other ones are just like, you know, it just evoking the kind of universal we without any regard for that there could even be another experience. And that's part of the manifesto tradition too, is just the taking of voice in whatever way one chooses to do, even if it would seem a bit reckless in other sorts of genres. And it makes that kind of exciting and strange, right? Where you have all these writers not really making space for, you know, qualified disagreement, or, you know, like having debate is not really what they're interested in. They're much more interested in, like you said, sort of throwing a brick through a window and seeing what happens, or making a case for revolution on their own terms, even if they have no real like power to be speaking about that. And that's what makes it sort of fun to me as well.
Yeah, I think I was thinking reading these that women also often feel obligated to sort of justify the space that they're taking up in various ways by being, you know, extremely qualified or very polite or very tactful or having thoroughly researched something. And I think what feels so liberating and delightful about a lot of these manifestos is the authors are just sort of going, fuck it, like I'm gonna say some shit, I don't really have to back it up. I believe this. And they sort of feel free to throw a bomb. And I think it's very satisfying for that reason. It's assuming a world, or it feels like the person is living in a world where you would not be expected to justify things, or you wouldn't feel obligated to. And I think that feels really good to read.
Yeah, there's no regard for like citational practice or historicizing oneself or qualifying oneself or credentialing oneself. And I think, especially for people within academia, we realize how exhausting that is when you read writing that's sort of like jumping across that and not doing it, especially for women. And I think that's another thing about this collection, again, that feels really important to me, is that, if we're thinking of, well, what is a feminist manifesto, right? It's sort of this feminism of againstness. It's also a feminism where we don't have to actually have certain sorts of credentials to speak, right? And that is in some ways something that feels good, even if we can't necessarily always put words for why that feels good. I mean, there's people in here who have never published anything and may never publish anything again, I don't know. But people who are really speaking to us like from a super, super marginalized perspective in every imaginable sense, I mean, not to mention the people that we know in here are also, many of them are also speaking from just incredible positions of marginality. And so when we hear them speak, it feels, and manifestos feel this way to me anyway, it feels like people are telling the truth about things, and they're telling the truth about themselves, but in a way that's very different. Even when I teach manifestos, I'm shocked by how amazing some of the student manifestos that I've heard and seen and read have been. There's just so many ways in which it accesses different modes of language where you're right, people aren't apologizing and saying they're sorry and making everyone know that they have like a grounds on which to stand. They just do it, and maybe it definitely provokes me to think about how can we have that experience way more often outside of just this genre or just this kind of style of writing, where we can speak and write in different ways that are really trying to access like these voices, from the gutter, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like getting out from under the male gaze in the sense that you are not attempting to justify yourself, which does have that satisfying feeling. And I wonder, when you think about having that experience more often, one of the things that happened to feminism was that to some degree, it was brought indoors, so that now we have sort of well-heeled nonprofits and lobbying firms and, NGOs that sort of do the work sort of feminism, and that those are not spaces that welcome this way of communicating, certainly, but they're also not spaces that have that feeling because they've been domesticated, if you will, and sort of turned into these very polished and professional spaces in which no one in this book would really be at home. And I wonder if manifestos or expressions of the spirit in this book that are very striking to you right now, that sort of fly in the face of that particular 21st century norm.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about your first comment. I mean, if you think about like the brochures you get from Planned Parenthood, like you wonder, where is like the scrappy, pro-abortion activism in this face, right? And like this book has several manifestos that are just like shamelessly pro-abortion, and thinking about what the difference is between being pro-abortion and sort of pro-choice and that sort of stuff. So you're absolutely right that this sense of like how different feminist priorities get co-opted and sucked into like a much more sanitized, manicured, corporatized, shave off the edges version. This book is trying to keep those edges alive, and edges that often we may not even like. I mean, I would imagine no one will read this entire book if you do and get through it by thinking that all of them were wonderful. I mean, some of these manifestos were like totally offensive at times, or like absurd or outrageous, or just things that you just frankly can't agree with. And I mean, that's a really important moment to just, you know, to not disregard that kind of writing as well. But I think also another thing that I was saying when you're asking about what am I enjoying right now, and this of the moment thing, I also love how feminist manifestos are sometimes written by individuals and sometimes written in these collectives, and there can be this movement between, like, the whole notion of authorship also gets exploded in this wonderful way where some people don't even want their actual names attached to it. So I think there's like so much we can learn about how to do this differently in terms of embracing, you know, feminist writing and what that might look like and things too, that, you know, when people can like think of it in totally weird, expansive ways about, you know, how do we write things together? How do we think, I mean, sometimes it's fine to be like the loner, like typing on the typewriter furiously as well, but just thinking about this, like the range expanding in terms of, you know, the length of writing, the style of writing, the complaints, you know, and I love the notion of thinking about the legitimacy of feminist complaint in general, that like we have the right to have these grievances, and like this notion that that women are supposed to be, I think politeness and respectability also shave that off, right? The notion of complaint and rage and all of that stuff that gets framed in highly negative terms rather than as something transformative. I think you're muted, sorry. There you go.
I want to ask you one last question while we wait for, we're going to give people an opportunity to send questions in, which is just, I was just curious how you went about collecting these. It seems like the most pleasurable archival journey of all time, but also like you could have gone anywhere to any place. It could have gone on perhaps forever. And this is quite a robust collection, but I was sort of curious what that looked like.
I mean, when you said that, I think my first impulse is like, I hope it goes on forever, continuing forward. You know, I love manifestos, and people have sent them to me over the years. I did a bunch of archival work when I was working on the biography of Valerie Solanas, and so I found a bunch of the ones from the 70s and that journey. I've like found some of them in like these weird corners of the world and in zines or on, you know, funny corners of the internet. People have sent, because they know I'm so interested in manifestos, a whole bunch of people, maybe people are also here in the audience, have sent me manifestos over the years. So yeah, it has been deeply pleasurable though. I mean, I think that later point you made is totally right, that there's something about just having these documents in the world at all that feels somewhat miraculous to me, that they exist or get circulated, or that people would write them and feel like vulnerable enough to just share them with the world in any way. I mean, they're deeply personal, and maybe even, you know, these little missiles of love or something that people are putting out there about things that they hate or that they find despicable or repulsive, or how the world needs to change. That's incredible writing in some ways. So yeah, I hope this is like the beginning of more bodies of work that we can look at in terms of feminist manifestos, and that there's going to be a robust future of them, which I do actually, I guess in my more hopeful moments, think there will be, you know, that this is a tiny drop in the bucket of what we can see in this whole body of work. So let's hope. And let's hope that people feel entitled to write them, which is, I think for me, an even more important point, right? That people feel entitled to think like this, or to speak like this, or to appropriate this voice of authority, even if they don't feel like they have it. Because that's really what writing also does, that I think can be really problematic, is, you know, we teach people that you only get to have this authority if other people say that you do. And manifesto genres cut straight through that as well, that it's about the self, like it's like oneself or one's group, let's say, investing oneself with authority and not waiting for, you know, for a publishing house to validate you or any of these other things, like just that you go straight forward with that work. So, you know, it's also about like this sort of mind shift or mentality that we have to think differently about with regard to writing in general, and that, you know, you will find an audience if you tell the truth, I think, in certain ways. And the manifesto teaches us that for sure.
Okay, I have two questions for you from the audience. And I'm going to give them both to you, and you can answer them in the proportion you like. So okay. The first is, who is your personal feminist heroine in your circle of influence? interpret your circle as you will, but you're personal feminist heroine. And the other question is, did you have alternate titles for the book? And were there any manifestos that were left on the cutting room floor, and why?
So I'll answer the second one first, because this is actually a funny story. So the original title for this book, and the press asked me to take off the second half of this title. The original title was Burn It Down, Feminist Manifestos for the Revolution and/or Apocalypse. And the press asked me to take off the and/or apocalypse because, I don't know, maybe it was too dark at the time, or it felt a little, I don't know, churchy or something. I don't know. But now I really wish that that second half was on there, because in some ways this book is being born in the middle of this moment where, you know, it's all about nihilism and the end of the world and the world as we know it changing, and we have to make a new world order, you know, all this stuff, I think. So in some ways it's like a funny, potentially unfortunate cut. But the title itself, I mean, one thing that I had such a good time making this title was that I had an editor who kept pushing me to be more radical and more out there, which I've never in my life had that experience where, you know, she's like, I think we could go a little harder on this, or like, let's make a title that's even more kind of confrontational. I never had that experience. So I have nothing but good things to say, in all honesty, about the kind of like mentality and direction that I was sort of pushed in with this book, with the press. I've never worked with a press that like didn't just try to like rein me in a lot. And so that felt really nice. There were definitely manifestos that got left out. Mostly though, I was able to include all of the ones that meant the most to me. The ones that got left out were mostly in this category of manifestos that I really, really enjoy and like, but that may not actually be considered distinctly feminist, whatever that is. So there were quite, like, you know, for example, there's a couple of essays by James Baldwin. There were like some historical manifestos, you know, like, you know, early documents of like the Black Panthers, like different things like this that we decided, you know, kind of collectively like, okay, this is, you know, maybe we'll leave these out so we can really try to showcase more of what feminist manifestos are doing that's distinct. And so I had to sort of make some decisions around that felt, I really do feel okay about how that went though. But yeah, the titling is always super crazy, and the aesthetic choices, and I'm just really pleased with how that turned out, because it doesn't always go that well, you know? As to the other question, oh gosh, feminist heroine, that's so hard, because my deepest impulse is to like never treat anyone as a sort of hero figure, because it's so fraught and problematic, and you end up sort of feeling disappointed, and also you strip away some of like the weird humanity of that. I know that's a terrible answer and not what people are looking for, but I think that's even been true. You know, I suppose one could say that I devoted 10 years of my life working on this biography of Valerie Solanas. So I have a deep like affection for her as a thinker, and as a sort of troublemaker and problematic character and all these things. But I never tried to think of her as a hero per se, because I always felt like, you know, there were things about her that like I couldn't live with, but that didn't in any way diminish her importance or what she means to the history of feminist thought on some level. So I don't know, there's so many people that I admire, or that I draw from, or that I think about a lot, or, you know, that I need, I guess, and, you know, many people could be included in under that category, but I always would, I think, stop shy of directly talking about anyone in the language of heroes or heroines.
I have a couple more questions. So one is the reception this book has received has been inspiring. And did you anticipate what a warm welcome it would get? Did you anticipate any kind of backlash or negative reaction? And the perhaps related question is, do you think the internet has made the writing, consumption, and dissemination of manifestos stronger or weaker? And do you have an opinion on how the internet has changed manifestos as a genre?
Yeah, I'll do it in reverse as well. I think the internet has been really helpful, again, in like democratizing writing to a certain degree, so that people writing like weird, you know, angry missives can have a sort of audience for those, or those can find their way through the world a little bit differently. So that's sort of exciting. I mean, there's a lot of writing that I've found, like, again, when I've been looking through archives, doing archival work from lots of like late 60s, early 70s feminism, that you just see how much writing got lost, right? How much, it ended up in these like zines that like fell out of focus that we never found again. And so I think these old histories of like trying to bring back sort of lost or forgotten or sidelined or discarded writings is in some ways like, it's probably a product, I think, of this moment where we can draw on the internet to so readily find things. And I get irritated when I can't easily find things. And I think that's also like a gift that we have from the internet. I mean, which isn't to say that the internet doesn't come with all sorts of its own problems, and it is pretty substantial. I mean, I worry sometimes, like even on the basic level of what happens when people direct so much energy into things like social media at the expense of like really harnessing a sense of their own voice. Like, and I'm not sure that those are always like opposite of each other, but people do complain a lot to me about the exhaustion that they feel from like trying to keep up with the internet and its like unmanageable pace. And I think that's worth thinking about more deeply in terms of, what would people ideally like to be writing and what do they spend their time and energy writing, and trying to make that like, merge a little bit closer together. And that's always, I mean, for myself too, that's a really difficult project, right? Figuring out, because everything, we live in a capitalist economy down to every level in which we operate. And I mean, that is so true in terms of writing and productivity and our relationship to the internet as well, that, it is always going to be a sort of punishing relationship that we have towards productivity or the way that we express voice and that sort of thing. So I think we have to be careful about where that energy goes. And I worry about that with the internet. So can you tell me the first question again? I've gotten on the tangent now, I forgot.
The first question was about the reception of the book. Did you anticipate?
Oh, right.
Did you expect anything else?
Yeah, I mean, my metric for writing books is always write a book that you wish were in the world. I mean, this is really true. I have taught a class on manifestos for almost 10 years. There's not been anything like this. And I've been frustrated by that. And that's in part also why I wanted to compile this collection, because it's a book that I need in my life. And I even feel like that now. It's so nice. It's nice interacting with this book in this moment. Like I've kept it on my desk for like the last month and just, been like thumbing through it like daily. It's fun. It's fun to interact with this book. And I feel proud of that in some ways, that it's like a book that I wanted to be in the world and that it's in the world now on some level. So the critical reception, I mean, of course it matters, but it matters a little bit less than the sense that I really do believe that this book needs to be in the world and that people need to have access to it. And so I guess like in the best case scenario, it's like if you write a book that you can stand by, then that's like the thing that matters the most. And hopefully like the critical reception falls in line with that. And if it doesn't, then you live with it anyway. I mean, on some level, there's lots of choices I've made with this book that I have to live with and deal with and, stand by. And I'm trying to sort of, not go back and like beat myself up about things, about choices that I've made. And so far, so good, but yeah, right-wingers never figure out how to criticize me about the right things. I feel like they're always mad about my writing about body hair, and they'll let this one slide. So that sort of feels funny to me, like they get so frothed up and mad about the stupidest things instead of the things that feel like the most kind of like potent politically or important. So, this book to me feels like a book that who knows whose hands it'll find its way into, but so far, it's been really enjoyable. It's always enjoyable to like interact with other feminists who are reading, things that you've written and responding to work that's been around a long time, that's maybe finding a new voice or a new audience. And so I hope that everyone in this audience will buy and enjoy this book, because it is really fun to sort of have right now, I have to say.
And I have one more question in the queue. This is sort of a perennial question, which is, I have one question asking whether young men right now can be feminists, which I would certainly hope they'd be able to have, a ready entry to at this point. But I would maybe just add to that, since you mentioned in your last question, what sorts of encounters producing and putting this book out into the world has brought you into? What what sorts of people you're finding find this book, are interested in this book, or are excited that it's.
Yeah, I mean, so of course the answer to the first question would be yes. Where would we be without feminist men? I feel like we would be in dire straits in every way. You know, I mean, not only is that sort of a welcome invitation, but we're counting on it. You know, I mean, we need that. We need that as much as anything. We need, you know, allies to all things feminist, all things in the struggle of, you know, against power and all the abuses of power. So yes to that, for sure. And then, sorry, say the second half of that again.
I was just curious, since this book is sort of a resource for people who are doing their own feminist politics of various kinds, whether putting the book into the world was putting you in touch with people, or, you know, producing.
Yeah, no, it has been. It's been interesting. Like, I get emails from people that are definitely describing it as like an antidote to loneliness. And that feels like, you know, something that of course we could never have anticipated about putting the book out right now, is that it would be an antidote to loneliness, because of course the book was not meant to come out, you know, per se in a time of just like unprecedented isolation and, you know, it's kind of an interiority, reflectiveness, people stuck at home, sort of, you know, struggling to like maybe think about what to read or consume or watch or whatever they're doing. So I think that's been really nice. You know, I like the idea that this volume of, you know, all these feminists in various forms of disagreement or agreement or historical, you know, companions or not, can be like this nice little, you know, antidote to loneliness. That feels really important and actually kind of sweet in its own way, that, you know, like I'm saying, I do think that's true. Anger feels like sometimes, angry writing, anger itself, like it's so destructive, but I actually don't see it that way. I really see anger as a kind of like world building entity, you know, and I even feel like that, of course, as a therapist, which is not always incredibly popular as a position to take as a therapist, but I do think that. I think anger is very world building. It's creative. It can do things, I think, if channeled in certain directions, that's very important. And so, you know, I'm hoping right now that this book fits into this funny moment where people are lonely, or maybe they feel sort of isolated, or they don't feel like they have companionship in terms of their political ideas and things like this. But it's also, I'm hoping it can work to sort of generate like solidarity among collective rage, right? Because we're about to feel really angry about what's happening to us with this virus. I feel like that's coming. It's maybe, and we're not there yet because it's still early, but the rage that we're going to feel about the cascade of betrayals that are going to befall us and are befalling us, I think will be very, very intense. So I'm hoping that the book can also work in that direction. And some people have definitely reacted to it that way, you know, sort of saying that it helps them to direct their anger, or to figure out like, wow, I'm not the only person who feels angry about this, or people have been angry about this for decades, and what does that mean? And you know, someone asked me recently, does that feel depressing that like women in particular are like still fighting the same battles over and over and over for decade after decade? And I actually don't find that even the least bit depressing, because it reminds us that like when we feel alone and like struggle in general, we usually aren't, right? And we haven't been ever. There's been a long and rich and productive history of people, you know, feeling rage about, and, you know, doing activism about, and calling things out and writing about, and, you know, sort of trying to form a game plan for this for as long as we can remember. And that stuff feels really helpful to remember too, that like sometimes activism, I think, can feel lonely or discouraging. Sometimes even just being angry about politics can feel lonely and discouraging, but it's not, right? In some level, like we have to see ourselves within this genealogical practice of so many generations of people who've come before, thinking not just in similar ways, because it's not always in similar ways, but having similar styles of complaints or of things, you know, of grievances, and that these things like have a tradition. They have a historical, you know, tradition for us that we need to kind of take seriously and think about, and maybe even learn to feel affection for, or be a little easier on ourselves when we feel that way, you know?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, because it gives you the community, not just horizontally within your time, but sort of across time as well. You have a genealogy as well as your comrades in the present. I think that that might be the most natural and actually quite beautiful place to wrap. I would like to really encourage people to buy this book, which is fantastic. And as Breanne said, even well handled by its editors and turned into something quite enjoyable to have and to read through. I want to thank Breanne for bringing this incredible book into the world. I want to thank Bluestockings for being the best tiny bookstore in New York and, you know, a haven when we're able to go there. And also to Verso Books, which put this together and published this wonderful book. Breanne, any last words from you?
Oh, that's the perfect ending. Yeah, I mean, you know, thank goodness we have feminist bookstores still. And I think, you know, for those of us who aren't in New York, we may not even know what that is, because feminist bookstores are such a dying art that when you find one, it feels like this weird little utopia that, you know, you can't be without ever again. So I'm also very grateful, you know, to Bluestockings, but also to Verso for continuing to publish like really intense feminist work that's very much on the edge. And I hope that you will buy this book either, again, through your local bookstore, or you can buy it directly through Verso, who's running a 50% off all print books right now sale, which is really amazing, actually. So pick up that and a whole bunch of other fun stuff if you can. And yeah, and if you ever want to be in touch or send me manifestos or talk about any of this, you can easily find me. So don't hesitate.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.